This is Democracy Watch. So, Mark, we've got an update from Illinois regarding Trump's eligibility to be on the ballot in that state. Can you explain what happened at the Board of Elections?
Yeah, so this is really, wrong. I mean, just to call it out, the Board of Elections in Illinois said that it did not have the power, didn't have what the legal term is jurisdiction to kick Trump off the ballot, even though a Republican retired judge had found that Trump was involved in an insurrection, was disqualified under the 14th Amendment, and the board didn't even disagree with that. But they said that it's not in their power to do anything about the fact that Donald Trump is ineligible.
Well, Mark, if these people found that Trump engaged in insurrection, then shouldn't it be self-executing from there? Like that is a very that like in the plain text of the Constitution, that's a disqualifying factor for running for office again. So isn't that the end of the story? Why do they not know what to do after a point where they've already declared something that would immediately automatically render him ineligible to run for office?
Look, this is, I think, the biggest concern I have right now on this issue. And it's the concern I have about the Supreme Court. It's the concern I have about these states, is that nobody wants to make the hard decision. They all look at the law. The law is pretty clear. They read the constitutional provision, very clear. They look at the facts of what Donald Trump did, very clear. But like, no one wants to be the one to say, yeah, we're kicking him off the ballot, because that's what the Constitution says. And so we just need, whether it's the judiciary, in the case of the Supreme Court, some of these state courts, or in this case, the Board of Elections, we just need people to just, look at the law and the Constitution and just apply it and stop worrying about, whether it's a really big step or not big step. That's baked into the Constitution.
Right, right. To that exact point, if the elections board hearing officer, this retired Republican judge, ruled that a court and not the elections board has to decide this issue, will it then go to the courts to be decided?
Yeah, it's going to go to the courts. I mean, that's the good news. It's going to go to they'll appeal it to the Illinois state courts, and it'll go up through that system. And in the meantime, we're all going to be waiting to see what happens with the U.S. Supreme Court in the Colorado case. That will probably dictate this across the country. But again, I am continuing to hear these voices saying in various forms, political, judicial, that, the law is, the Constitution says insurrection, and he appears to have been an insurrectionist, or he was an insurrectionist, but, it's a really big step. And, I just wrote a piece for Democracy Docket on this, that we cannot allow the courts to ignore the plain text of the Constitution because they're trying to not be political. That would be the most political thing to do, right, would be to ignore the Constitution because you're afraid it's going to upset a bunch of MAGA people.
Right, and by the way, for anybody watching, that article on Democracy Docket was stellar. If you're not yet subscribed to Democracy Docket, which is the free news outlet Mark founded to focus on everything voting in elections, you should definitely subscribe. I'll put the link right here on this screen and in the post description of this video. Mark, at this point, are the courts even going to take up this issue of disqualification, given that we're waiting on an imminent ruling from the Supreme Court?
So they should. Look, the courts around the country should keep moving forward, because the Supreme Court is gonna have its hearing on February 8th. It'll take a little bit of time for it to reach its ruling, and the courts need to be ready to act. Now, they may decide they don't want to issue their decisions until they get this word from the Supreme Court, but they should keep the process moving, because we don't want to have a situation where, the states run out of time because ballots have to be printed and the like. So I'm a big believer that everything should keep going forward while we wait for the Supreme Court to act.
What significance does it hold that this retired judge, who was a Republican, the first Republican in the country to issue such a ruling, that he did so as a member of that party?
Look, I think the wheels are coming off the Trump wagon when it comes to the idea of him not being an insurrectionist. We talked about this a few weeks ago on an episode, that if you read the Trump brief, it was very, very tentative, or it was not confident, I think is the word I use. It was not confident about the insurrectionist point. It does a whole bunch of, doesn't apply to president, not the right oath, does a whole bunch of stuff. But there is a building consensus, and I think that the Trump folks realize this because they are facing this in criminal cases. There is a building consensus and a mounting or a mounted body of evidence that is really hard to contradict, that he was, in fact, an insurrectionist, that he did, in fact, engage in an effort to overturn free and fair elections. So the fact that we saw a Republican judge, retired judge, be part of that here in Illinois, very significant. The fact that the bipartisan Illinois State Board of Elections, even though they didn't do what I thought they should, on a bipartisan basis, they seemed to accept the fact that he was an insurrectionist. They just didn't think they had the power to do anything about it. So it seems like we're almost, as a country, moving beyond the question of whether or not he was an insurrectionist and just moving to these more technical legal questions.
Now, what other states should we be keeping an eye on with regard to Trump's eligibility to run for office?
So obviously the biggest one is Colorado, because that's going to the U.S. Supreme Court. And I just again want to mention that is going to be heard on February 8th, and that will probably rule everything else. Maine is another state that's pretty far along. You may remember there, the Secretary of State did the right thing, said insurrectionist doesn't qualify. That's now going up through the courts there. But I expect, in Illinois now, I expect though you're going to see a whole bunch of these states that have already taken some tentative rulings or tentative steps saying they can't rule, they do have a jurisdiction, they don't. I think that it's the whole ball game is going to be Colorado.
When do you expect a decision ultimately from the Supreme Court? I know you said that these arguments begin on February 8th.
Yeah. So look, let's set the outer goalposts and then talk reality. The outer goalposts are the end of June. Why do I say that? Because the Supreme Court term ends the end of June, but it's going to be way before that. I think we're going to get a ruling in the month of February. And just to be clear, I know we're waiting on the DC Circuit on the immunity ruling, and people are like, why is that taking so long? I'm not saying that the U.S. Supreme Court is going to rule in a week on this question, but I think in the month of February is very doable and would make sense for the Supreme Court.
Now, let's finish off with this. Notwithstanding your own personal thoughts on Section 3 of the 14th Amendment on Trump's eligibility to run for office, I think we've spoken about that at length here. How do you presume that this 6-3 conservative Supreme Court will rule on this issue?
Yeah, so everyone who's looking at the Supreme Court on February 8th, either in person or listening online, and everyone, good civics lesson to listen to this, Democracy Docket will have links to it, and I'm sure there'll be a million places you can go and listen to it. This is what you want to watch for, right? There are 3 liberal justices rather, and let's just assume for a moment that they will be in favor of upholding the Colorado Supreme Court. Then you have 6 conservatives. And just to be clear, they're all conservatives, right? There are no moderates here. They're all conservatives. But I break those 6 into 2 groups. You have Justice Thomas, Justice Alito, Justice Gorsuch. Probably going to be hard to get any of the 3 of them, I'm suspecting. So then you have 3, the Chief Justice, who is institutionalist. You have Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Comey Barrett. Again, very conservative justices, but the chief is an institutionalist, and the chief takes the Constitution seriously and the oath of office seriously. So I think what you want to be watching in that argument is, what do those 3 justices ask questions about? What do they say? What signals do they give as to where they are leaning? Now, do I hold out hope, that they will do the right thing? Yes, I hold out hope. Why? Because the plain text of the Constitution really puts them in a box. The conservatives call themselves textualists and originalists, right. And textually, Trump's off the ballot. As an originalist, he should be off the ballot. And I think that when push comes to shove, it's going to be a question of whether the chief is able to pull those other 3 justices, or 2 of them, into the 3 more liberal justices to do the right thing, or whether this just breaks down on ideological grounds, which would be really bad for democracy.
Generally, when you're watching these Supreme Court arguments take place, do the judges kind of give away where they stand based on the questions that they ask, or do sometimes they ask questions that have no bearing on whether they're leaning one way or the other?
Look, I think it's a mixture of both. I think that advocates, and look, I've done this. Someone can go pull up old clips of me walking out the Supreme Court and giving press conferences, and they ask about it, and I say, you can't tell anything from the questions. You can tell a
Yeah.
little bit from the questions. It is not the case that the questions are meaningless, and they become much more impactful because the Supreme Court after COVID really changed the way they do oral argument now. Every justice has a turn to ask questions. And so you get a lot more questions from justices that in the past might have sat back and not asked, and you really wouldn't know where they stand. So it's not determinative because the justices are trying to ask questions of both sides to try to figure out where the friction points are and where the center of the argument is. But I think we'll know a lot after the argument. And I know you and I will be back, as a lot of people will be back doing a post-game analysis, and we'll have a lot more to know then and to say.
Of course, and for those watching, you can find that analysis right here. You can also find it on Democracy Docket. So again, if you're not yet subscribed, definitely make sure to subscribe. The links are on the screen and in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Taylor Cohen.
I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.